what I'd like to start by doing is going through, I think, immigration is a contentious issue here in the United States. It kind of died down as a political issue a little bit with the downturn in the business cycle where not as many illegal immigrants were trying to come in. But it's kind of kicked back up as more states are considering passing Arizona-style, what I call your papers, please, laws. And unfortunately, I think a lot of the public debate is centered around the wrong things that aren't really problems with immigration. So what I'd like to do is go through, I think, probably 3 of the bigger myths about immigration, and then talk about some of the other issues that I think are more complex and need to be dealt with if you're going to have a more open immigration policy. So the first one is, you hear it from people, immigrants are going to drag down our economy, or they are a drag or a net drag on our economy. Economists across the ideological spectrum, and even economists opposed to immigration, don't think this. On net, economists find immigration adds to the US economy. So the estimates vary, but to take like George Borjas, a Harvard economist and probably the most prominent critic of immigration who's an economist. And his last estimates put it at a net gain to the US economy of about $20 billion or so. That's a few years old. If you used his method and just updated the numbers, it would work out to about $36 billion or so, which is a net gain, but in the scope of things, $36 billion, it's small as a fraction of our $13 trillion economy. But it's certainly not something that economists find as a drag on it. But there's a few reasons to keep in mind why that number isn't larger. One, an obvious one is, it comes from our current restrictive immigration policy that doesn't let more people in. 2, it comes from the current mix of immigrants where a lot of them come here illegally and as a result don't get to make full use of their talents. And 3, it also is a product of an immigration policy where we put skill caps or caps on skilled workers under the H-1B visas that can come in. So I think there could be ways that immigration would be much more beneficial to us than it already is in terms of net gains for our economy. But even as we have it now, we find net gains. It's not a drag. The probably most popular fallacy that people come up with immigration, it's in fact so frequent that it even made South Park, right, is, quote, they steal our jobs. Like on net, they're displacing us from our jobs. And I think there's a reason for this. It's because of classic what Bastiat calls the seen and the unseen. When an immigrant comes to the United States and there's somebody who used to do that job, who loses that job to the immigrant, you can put the camera on them and easily see them in the news and say, this guy says, I lost my job because of immigrants coming in. This could be a construction worker, someone in agriculture, what have you. And people extrapolate from that, therefore the immigrants on net are taking our jobs away. But what also happens is because immigrants are here, they create demands for additional goods and services, and other Americans want other goods and services as well. You create a new job for that guy who got displaced. So if this wasn't the case, if literally just adding more people to the economy meant displacing, like if we had a fixed pool of jobs, think what the history of like the last 60 years would look like. Massive entry of women, baby boomers, and immigrants into the workforce. But where's the long-term increase in structural unemployment? It's not there. I mean, we have higher unemployment right now, but that's part of cyclical business cycle movements. Over the long term, we've had a huge increase in the labor force, but also a huge increase in total employment. Basically, as we've got more people, we've put them to work. Related to this, it's also the case that a lot of these jobs might not continue to exist in the United States if it wasn't for immigrants coming in to perform them. So this happens at both the high and the low-skilled end of the job spectrum. So Bill Gates has said he'd outsource fewer jobs to India if he could get more skilled workers into the United States under the H-1B visa program. And that's a program that almost every year in April when the H-1B visas become available, on the first day or 2 of the program, they run out of their allotment for them for the entire year then. Quite common for this to happen. Also happens on the lower end of the skill spectrum. Over 1/3 of all garment workers in the United States are immigrants to the United States. So more of those jobs likely would have gone to factories overseas had the immigrants not been here. It's popular in the debate for people to say things like, immigrants do the jobs Americans won't do. And I think that's fair enough, but critics of immigration usually respond, but Americans would do them if the wage were higher. And I think that's a fair response. But it begs the question, would the job exist if the wages were higher? So we have evidence of cases where this simply isn't the case, that there wouldn't be the job if the wage had to be higher. In fact, we could look a few years ago, during agricultural labor shortage, Arizona, the lettuce crop, the fall lettuce crop that was being harvested, they left a whole bunch of it in the ground. So they couldn't get enough labor, in part because of immigration restrictions, but they only harvested 30% of the crop. They left 2/3 of the crop in the ground to rot. They took losses of about $1 billion. Could they have bid up the price of labor and got Americans who were within the country to come there and harvest the crop? Absolutely. But the cost of bidding up the wages high enough to get the Americans to come there and take those jobs would have made them make even greater losses than the billion. It made more sense to leave them in the ground rotting. Or if more immigrants could have come in and harvested, the crop would have been harvested. There's no net displacement of American jobs. It's just jobs that wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the immigrants. So this leads us to the third, what I think of as fallacy of immigration, is that they depress our wages then. So I imagine that there's a number of economics students or students in the room who have taken an economics course. So Econ 101, first blush of this, you would say, of course immigrants shouldn't decrease your number of jobs. You just go back into your supply and demand diagram, right? And if you have immigration, what are you doing? You're shifting the supply of labor out. Well, if you shift the supply of labor out, what's going to happen? Total employment will increase, but what should happen to wages? Push wages down. But here's what so the economists tend to specialize a lot. And the kind of joke goes, actually, you hyper-specialize and you know more and more about less and less till you know absolutely everything about absolutely nothing. So as a result of this, economists sometimes aren't even very good at talking to each other, let alone audiences of normal people. So they created a journal called Journal of Economic Perspectives, and the point of the journal is to kind of summarize fields of research for other economists. So that the macroeconomists can read about the labor economists' work. So they did an article there on immigration, and this is what the article concluded. Quote, despite the popular belief that immigrants have a large adverse impact on the wages and employment opportunities of the native-born population, the literature on this question does not provide much support for the conclusion. In fact, what we find for a wage effect, and this varies depending on the study, is somewhere between no effect or even a slightly positive effect to about a negative 8% effect only on the wages of people without a high school diploma in the United States who are directly competing with the unskilled labor that's coming in. That's about the only place we find it. And even there, negative 8% is about the worst, and sometimes 0 or slightly positive. And it should be kept in mind that that's an increasingly small proportion of American society as well. So this brings up the question of how is this possible then? Remember supply and demand, you're shifting supply of labor out, shouldn't that push down the wages? And in fact, I wrote, I've actually written a few op-eds and columns and stuff on immigration. Nothing actually generates more hate mail, I suppose probably regardless of what side you take, than a column on immigration. I get my fair share of hate mail for other things, but immigration is always a spike, which is kind of fun. But on one particular occasion, and usually when it's just like, if people are just disagreeing and have points, I try to respond to most of it. But when they're just name calling, I generally delete. But in one instance, when I wrote basically this point that it doesn't depress the wages of Americans, I got a flaming email from somebody that was kind of nasty, and I had come home and already had cocktails actually, so I was just feeling like having fun with them. So I usually would have deleted it, but I didn't, I responded. And then he actually came back then, and his second response was much more reasonable, and this is basically the point he raised. He said, how can you be an economist and not realize that when you shift the supply of labor out, it's got to push down wages? What's wrong with you, basically? So then I started getting into the debate with him about all of this different evidence on these things, some of which I'm about to share with you. And in the end, he asked, can I run this, our correspondence on my website as an article? And I kind of had to look back, especially to the drunk one I sent him. And I said, yeah, you can run it all. Just don't edit it. Reprint it exactly as is, and that's fine. And send me a link so I can see what it is when you do. And he told me that it was going to be called Economist Denies the Laws of Supply and Demand, which is kind of an amusing thing to be accused of. But he actually read all the references I sent him, and he changed the title of the article when he ran it. It was called Economics Profession Denies the Laws of Supply and Demand. It's also, as far as I know, the only time that I've been featured on a neo-Nazi webpage. But it was a hack job, so I was kind of pleased to be there. So how is this possible? Why doesn't it push down the wages? Well, first of all, is it the supply of labor? Or is it different labor? So if it's different labor, it's a whole other market that we're shifting in. It's not just adding homogeneous labor that's just like the rest of the American labor. If they have skill sets that are different, so it's a question of, are the immigrants substitutes for American labor, or are they complements to it? Do they bring a different skill set that makes the American labor more productive? So if you think of like the American labor force in general, the native-born labor force, there's a very small number that are at the very peak of the skill spectrum. There's also a fairly small number that are at the very bottom of the skill spectrum. We'll call high school, as a proxy for this, we can think of PhDs and high school dropouts being the two ends. But most people in the United States have a high school degree, have some college, have a bachelor's degree, associate's degree from college. A lot of people in the middle of the skill spectrum there. So if I was going to put like a picture to it, the American workforce, as you go from high skilled to low skilled, looks kind of like a diamond. Lots of people in the middle, few at the top, few at the bottom. What's the immigrant pool look like? Immigrant pool looks a lot different. Tends to be a lot of very low skilled immigrants come in, and also a lot of very high skilled immigrants come in. So the native born population makes up less than 1/3 of the people without high school diplomas in the United States. Similarly, only about 30% of PhDs are native born in the United States. So it's the immigrants that are coming in that, if we were going to put a shape to them, the group looks a lot more like an hourglass. A lot of them very high skilled, a lot of them very low skilled, not as many in the middle. As a result, when you push that diamond and hourglass together, it's not like the supply of labor. It's they're coming in and augmenting skill sets where Americans aren't as plentiful and not substituting for them where they are. So it frees up the American labor then to do the things that we have, in economics speak, a comparative advantage in, or what we're relatively more productive at. There's other reasons, I think, that and actually I mean personal examples of this, so it frees us up to do things that we're relatively more productive at. Just personal experience, my own life. I taught for 4 years in California before I moved to Boston, and there I had a house and a little, I'll say backyard, but it was smaller than this area in front of the screen probably. And it was like sloped and kind of nasty, and I wanted to turn it into a nice patio and bar area. And I got one estimate, and it was going to be an ungodly amount to do it. And I thought, well, I'll just dig it out, I'll do it myself. And then I had an opportunity to do a consulting project that was going to pay me a few bucks. And I said, well, maybe I can find somebody else that would be cheaper to do this. And I find someone who was employing immigrant labor. I didn't ask whether they were legal or illegal. I didn't really care. The person gave me a much lower estimate. And I said, okay, well, I won't do the digging out of my backyard that I could have done myself, but it's not what I'm relatively best at. Instead, I'll write the consulting report. I'll hire them to dig out the backyard. They dug it out, made the patio. On net, the world was, at least if the report was any good, wealthier by one report that wouldn't have been created otherwise. So it frees us up to do the things that we're relatively better at. It also freed my back up in that case because there was way more dirt that came out of there than I thought there was. I'm glad I didn't start. Other reasons that it doesn't push down wages. Well, a key assumption of shifting a supply curve is, economists use the little phrase ceteris paribus, all else constant. And usually when people make economic errors, it's because they're changing other things that aren't simultaneous to this. Well, in this case, in immigration, all else is not constant by definition. It's not just the supply of labor coming in. The immigrants don't come here and demand nothing. They also come here and demand goods and services. Well, if they demand goods and services, okay, our supply of labor shifted out, but so did the demand for labor shift out because we have to create the new goods and services that they're going to consume. Now, it's not a theoretical certainty whether wages go up, down, remain the same. It's an empirical question. So it could be exactly the same, it could push it down a little, could push it up a little, but it's a partial offset. So that's another reason. A third one is just specialization and division of labor, classic Adam Smith. It's limited by what he called the extent of the market. So in a smaller society with fewer people, you can specialize less finely, you have to do more general tasks. The more and more people you have integrated into your society, the more narrowly you can specialize in the things you do very best, and they specialize in what they do very best. In exchange, as a result, you're all wealthier. That's another reason why they come in and you don't find them pushing down wages. So I think these are probably the three biggest myths, and when people talk about immigration, they get all worked up about. They're stealing our jobs, depressing our wages, dragging down our economy. And these are things that economists who study immigration are pretty much all in agreement on, is very little effect on wages, only high school dropouts, and that's a small effect there. No net displacement in jobs, and on net, a small but positive effect on the overall economy. So this brings us to other issues to consider about immigration then. Although before I go to some of the problems on it, I should say actually one other benefit of immigration that I think that's fairly uncontroversial as well, is it's a form of foreign aid that actually helps people. So we've had abysmal failure with helping the third world develop through official development aid. I mean, the World Bank's got more than 60 years of existence of giving loans to Africa. From 1970 through 2000, sub-Saharan Africa had a negative growth rate. It wasn't growing slowly, it actually was getting poorer. That's a failure. And what we've learned in development economics is that what's necessary for long-term prosperity is they have to get their institutions of governance and economic freedom correct in order to get long-term prosperity. The problem is giving that to them from the outside. There's no magic pill that you can give them that gets them to adopt the institutions. Military interventionism doesn't work because once you leave, what the Constitution doesn't enforce itself. There's plenty of US-style constitutions floating around the world that governance there doesn't work anything like it does here. What has to be an ideological transformation in the third world that demands that type of governance. Maybe we're seeing some of that right now in the Middle East. That would certainly be great. But there's not much we can do from the outside. You can trade more freely with them, which helps them, and there's some evidence of what we call contagious capitalism. As a freer country trades with a less free country, the less free one tends to become more free. But these things are all fairly limited. Well, immigration is, in a sense, a form of foreign aid where we can actually have a big impact. Because it's wrong to conceive of like a piece of land having economic development. We don't care about a piece of land having economic development. We care about the humanity that's on that land. Like no one runs around like Antarctica doesn't have enough GDP, Antarctica doesn't have, it's just penguins, no one cares. We care about people in sub-Saharan Africa because it's people there, not the piece of land. So, you know, if someone from Haiti comes to the United States and earns a higher income, that's economic development for Haitians, just not for the patch of land called Haiti. So I think it can be an effective form of foreign aid. When it comes to reforming, this is where things get much more controversial. So these first things I've said, I think, are things that most economists who study immigration are largely in agreement with. After that, they start having lots of disagreements, and I think a lot of these other issues are much tougher. One of them is, what do you do with the current large population of illegal immigrants that are already in the United States? So while immigration's impact on the net economy overall is modest, it does hit some sectors particularly hard. So it's estimated that illegal immigrants perform about 24% of all farming jobs, 17% of all cleaning jobs, about a third of all butchery jobs. If there were going to be a large displacement of those workers, there are going to be significant sectoral effects in the United States of trying to do that. Also, just realistically, everybody saw when bills were being debated back in 2006, 2007, all of the big day without an immigrant protests. In fact, actually, that's the only time when my position on immigration almost wavered because I was so ticked off. I went to an Irish pub and I was going to have dinner, and they told me the kitchen staff wasn't there. As a result, I had to have Guinness for dinner, which I guess wasn't all bad. So it's a question of what to do with everybody's here. And my answer is, let's just be realistic about it. You're never going to deport a population that's that large and already here, so it has to be some version of a path to legality for them. Because keeping them illegal doesn't help them, and it puts limits on how they can integrate and help the rest of the native-born American population as well. Also, reform proposals that have come forward before, let's create a guest worker program. Depending on the details, could be helpful, but the way that they were proposed before when Kennedy and McCain were putting forward their bill that had guest worker programs, it was a trivial amount at the time. So they started with 500,000, it got down to around 200,000 guest workers per year that they were going to allow to come for a period of up to 5 years, and then they have to go home. But at the time, there were like 1 million illegal border attempts per year. So like sticking in a 200,000 guest worker program doesn't eliminate that big flow that's wanting to come here. The other thing that you have to be careful with guest worker programs is if you're going to have one, you don't want to tie the employee who comes here to a particular employer, because often coming from Mexico, they don't know what the best job is for them. Once they get here, you resort, and you want a flexible labor market where people can switch around without having to worry that if they're in between jobs for a few weeks that they're going to have to be deported or sent back or something. So the devil's in the details with a lot of that. One issue that comes up with this is at this point it's probably pretty clear that I'm pro greater immigration. People will say, so you believe in the right to immigrate? And I think this is a moral issue that economists don't necessarily have a comparative advantage in, but speaking as a person, I certainly have an opinion. I actually don't believe in a right to immigrate. I don't think immigrants have a right to come onto any particular piece of property. The same way I don't think any of you have a right to walk onto the piece of property that my house is on. I should be able to exclude you from that. But I also think we have a right, and this is the issue of freedom of association. As a property owner in the United States, I should be free to associate with whoever I'd like to invite onto my property to work, or to sell my property to, or to rent my property to. What right is it of other Americans to put a blanket filter at the border of who I may associate with on my property? So I think the right isn't with the immigrants, but it's with the existing property holders in the United States to bring people here. And similarly, for the people who don't want the immigrants here, I think they also have a right of freedom of disassociation. So I think right now, current immigration policy where people illegally cross the border and trespass across property owners' lands in Texas, New Mexico, California, Arizona, I think that violates their freedom of disassociation. Their property rights should be defended, and they should be able to exclude people from their land. And while I disagree with these preferences personally, I think some of our laws on discrimination in the United States result in the way that people are not allowed a freedom of disassociation. So if a particular neighborhood wants to form an association and all put covenants on their house and agree we won't sell our property or rent to immigrants, I think they should be free to do that. As a group, it's their property. If they would not like to associate, don't associate. Morally, I find it disgusting that that would be their choice, but I'd respect their right to disassociate. And I think if we gave people a greater freedom to disassociate, they might be more open to letting more immigrants in for those of us who would like to associate with them. The real problem here, and I think in practice, certainly when it comes to anything commercial, the profit incentive is a strong one. You're not going to see a large number of people who want freedom of disassociation when it actually costs them money. Discrimination, like most things, when you have to pay for it, people will buy a lot less of it. The problems that come in are then with the overlaps here, the public property, the streets, and other public policies. So I think these are where the real issues of immigration are and where we can have legitimate debate about how to address them. Some of them I don't think are that particularly hard. So crime is one that comes up a lot. People will say, immigrants come and they create crime. First, I think the vast majority of immigrants don't come here to do crime. They come here to work and make a better living for their family. But the ones who do, sure, there's incarceration costs. Well, do we have to have that policy? I think a better policy than don't let them in because some would commit crimes would be let them in, and if you commit crimes, send you home, deport them. Someone said to me once, would you also advocate that for native-born population? I said, well, you kind of lack in Australia. But in this case, you've actually got people who did come from somewhere, so make it conditional. Come in if you respect the laws and don't commit violent crimes against person or property. You're welcome to stay as long as you operate with people on a voluntary basis. Related to this is terrorism. People are afraid of terrorists coming from immigrants. Well, first of all, how good do we do right now at keeping terrorists out with current immigration policy? The ones who are in here came through channels, violated terms, and we're still here. And with the border policy that we have now, you have roughly, at sometimes, 1 million or more people attempting to cross the border illegally, most of whom just want to be workers. However, that's 1 million people for terrorists to blend among while illegally crossing the border. If instead you open a more open borders policy and let people actually come through legal checkpoints, you're not going to see all of the people who would be legitimate workers risking their lives in the desert. Instead, they're going to come through the checkpoints in El Paso, San Diego, wherever. The ones who are left to the desert then will be the much fewer ones who wouldn't get through the regular checkpoint because they're either a known criminal, a potential terrorist, or whatever. So I think with given existing enforcement costs, you could actually make us more safe from terrorism than you do right now because you'd free them up to target just those people who are more likely terrorists. Voting and citizenship. So some people are concerned that immigrants are going to come here and they're going to vote then and eventually change the American system, undermine our property rights, the things that brought us prosperity. I think there's a few different ways to think about this. So one, historically, that's inaccurate about immigrant groups as they've come here in the past. So 19th century immigrants tended to actually vote with the more anti-government party, the smaller government party, which at the time was the Democrats. And I'm just not clear, actually, either Republican or Democrat, which one's a small government party anymore. So it's not clear who they'd align to, but until all of this immigration policy crackdown before, back in the 2000 election, the Hispanic vote was actually largely Republican for Bush, at least in a lot of areas. So it's not clear how that breaks down to me. Also, they're coming here because their institutions in their home country aren't good. Why would they come here to vote back the bad institutions that made them poor before? And finally, why do we have to package this the way we do, where it's coming here, working, plus citizenship and voting eventually? Why not permanent worker status? You can come here and work, but we're not going to give you the right to vote to change the policies over other people. Or some variant of this. And I also think it's the case, if you had a more open border policy, a lot of them don't want to be US citizens and come here. A lot of them want to come here, earn enough money, and go home. If you look back to the 19th century again, about 1 out of every 3 immigrants who came eventually went back to their home country. And right now what you have is a time, and actually for that matter, in terms of our economics, immigration used to be countercyclical. So in boom times, more immigrants would be coming in when our labor markets are tight. When we'd have a recession, immigrants would leave. What's happening now, this current downturn, some immigrants are going home, but not nearly as many as they would have before. And the reason is because they're afraid they won't be able to get back in when times gets better. So instead you have people, construction work all dried up, and that was what a lot of immigrants were doing. A lot of them would have gone home. Now they're scavenging for farm jobs or whatever else that they can find right now, instead of going home and then coming back. So a lot of people would be more cyclical, come work for a season, go back, come work for a few years, build a home, go back. And there's lots of good reasons for this, but people having cultural attachment, family, friends, other things, that way of life that they want to keep, but they need to get a higher standard of living for themselves in the process. So I think a more open policy wouldn't necessarily lead to a huge block of people who want to become voters even. But it's certainly something that I think we could more seriously address with public debate, where there's legitimate differences between people, instead of debating stupid stuff, about jobs and wages. Sorry, gut reaction, sorry. Stupid stuff about jobs, wages, etc. Then with these, the big one that probably some of you are waiting for me to address is welfare state cost. So this could be local costs for hospitals, school districts, or it could be literally welfare payments on a larger scale to people. I think this is a problem. So part of it, though, is a product of our fiscal culture in the United States of what we have right now. So it's not that illegal immigrants even don't pay taxes. A lot of illegal immigrants pay taxes voluntarily. They created individual taxpayer identification numbers, ITINs, back in 1996. And it's largely, they don't have precise estimates of how many people who use those are illegal immigrants, but for the most part, anybody who would want one is someone who is an illegal immigrant. And between 1996 and 2003, they had collected about $50 billion in taxes there. They've collected more since. So most of the reason that they're paying these is in the hope that if one day there's a chance for an amnesty or legalization, if they can show that they've been paying taxes for a number of years, that they'll get to the front of the line. But beyond that, even when they don't directly pay taxes, immigrants can indirectly pay taxes. So if a business hires an immigrant worker, that's a signal that the business found it more profitable by hiring that immigrant than somebody else. Maybe they wouldn't have hired a worker at all and created the work that was done. As a result, that business makes more money, the business makes more money, it's a legal business, it pays taxes. So did the immigrant themselves pay taxes? No, but did they pay it indirectly through an employer who made more money? Yes. So it's not clear that they're overall a net fiscal drain. So the National Academy of Sciences 1997 study found over their lifetime, an immigrant pays more in taxes than they consume in social services. That study is obviously a bit dated, and with more illegal immigrants, it's not clear that that's still necessarily true. One of the big problems, though, is not that they don't pay more over their lifetime. It's that a lot of their taxes that they pay or generate go to the federal government, whereas a lot of the services immigrants consume are paid for by local governments. So it's certainly the case that lots of local communities experience a fiscal drain when they get a large number of immigrants, in particular illegal immigrants, that move into the community. But this isn't a problem of immigration per se, it's a problem of how the US taxes and distributes revenue. So that's where we should be addressing it, not by putting blanket restrictions on immigration. We should be readjusting tax policy. When it comes to the welfare state generally and education spending, health spending, again, I think this should be conditional. If immigrants bring benefits to the overall economy, to the people who hire and want to associate with them, and obviously to themselves, why can't the offer be conditional? Come here, but you're not going to have access to the school system. You have to pay for schooling if you'd like schools. Come here, but you have to pay for your own health care. There'll be no free health care for you. And by the way, one big reason why lots of illegal immigrants don't have any health insurance is because they're illegal and they're in the informal sector. If you made them into the legal market, much greater percentage of legal immigrants have health insurance than illegal ones. So part of that problem disappears anyway. But still, some of it remains. But make them pay their own way. I think you'd still find the large number of immigrants who want to come here under those conditions and make themselves better off in the process. So Milton Friedman said, it's just obvious. A welfare state and open immigration are incompatible. And I think he's largely correct. But from this, a lot of people who are conservatives or otherwise free market people take from it, therefore we should restrict immigration. I say, no, they've got exactly the wrong conclusion. So people who are advocates of markets don't think that we should socialize healthcare. But given the kind of weak socialization of healthcare that's already occurred in the United States and with more coming, we don't say, therefore, we should also restrict people's ability to decide whether they want to smoke cigarettes. We should get rid of all fatty foods. We should mandate 30 minutes of exercise per day. No, we say we shouldn't have done that first intervention that allows us to spill over cost onto others, our health costs being borne by other taxpayers. You fight to roll it back. Well, here, otherwise free market people say, look, there's an intervention in our labor market that, intervention with welfare benefits so people can spill over. As a result, we need another intervention, a blanket restriction to prevent people from coming into the United States to take it. No, you're running down the wrong way. Just start working to advocate getting rid of existing interventions that give you these odd effects when immigrants come in that make it not necessarily a net gain for a US citizen when they do. And also, let's have some consistency on it. For people who object to immigration because of your ability to spill over cost onto others because of a welfare state, I like to ask them, if I have a cousin in Ireland and I would like to invite him to come live on my property, you say I shouldn't be able to invite him over because he might spill over some of his costs onto you or other people through consuming welfare benefits or, for that matter, using public streets, whatever. Okay, do you also advocate that I should have to apply to the government for a permit if I would like to birth a child? Because you can be guaranteed that the child I have is going to be a net tax consumer for at least the first 18 years, probably longer. I'd bet on the guy from Ireland. He'd at least generate some booze tax for you, probably. Little consistency here. Most people aren't willing to say that they also believe in population control restrictions then. But if your real objection is the spillover cost because of welfare state effects, you should also not let Americans choose to create more people themselves who are going to spill over costs onto other people. And if you do take that position, then I think you're a bad person. The real problem here is spillovers, basically ability to spill over costs onto others, don't lead to optimal decision making. So what is the optimal number of immigrants? There's got to be some optimal number, right? Well, I don't know. What's the optimal number of people to move from, well, I did it, from California to Boston, from California to Massachusetts? What's the optimal flow? I don't know. How do we find out? Well, we let Californians and we let Bostonians evaluate job offers in different states, evaluate what the cost of living is, see where they get the best offer, where they can afford to live, and then they move. So they do it in response to price signals sent by costs of living and potential wages and other quality of life issues. Are there some spillover costs? Yeah, entitlements are different in California than in Massachusetts. California might go bankrupt. But those spillovers between those two areas, relatively small in difference. As a result, you get largely the optimal number of immigrants moving from California to Boston and vice versa, because we use price signals. Basically, the labor market's not unlike any other market. I mean, it's unlike it in that it's people who, because of other government policies, can spill over different costs onto the others. But it's still trade in a good or service, just like other types of trade. So the same reason that the Soviets couldn't plan the optimal number and quantity of shoes, we don't know the optimal number and quantity of immigrants. So how many should come into the United States? Well, what we should do is make them pay their full cost of being here, and then allow immigrants to decide whether they should come, go back, forth, and allow market forces to dictate that. Part of the problem of why, if we just went to open borders tomorrow, would we not get that result, is because they can spill over some of the costs onto others. You get more than the optimal number to start with. Right now, we get far, far less than the optimal number that come in. But as an economist, my reform proposal on this would be, let's work on internalizing the costs and benefits of migrating, and then let's use a market to find out how many people should come here. And in the meantime, don't kick out the ones who have already got here. So I guess with that, and I know there's a bunch more issues that we could discuss, but I imagine a lot of you have opinions or different angles that you'd like to take on this, and I know actually today even that there's a debate going on in your Colorado government about extending in-state tuition or something like that to immigrants that are here. So I'll open it up for questions from you guys to talk about any aspects of immigration you like. There's a microphone up here if you want to come up to it. And maybe if there's like more people with questions, if you like kind of come up towards it so that we're not waiting forever in between. Yes? Is it? I'm not sure this is on. Oh, is there a switch? Maybe. You turned it off on purpose, Antonio. All right. All right, don't worry about it. Just yell it out and I'll kind of paraphrase a question back if people can't hear it. Okay. So could everybody basically hear? Okay. two issues that I want to touch on. Discrimination that he raised is discrimination still an issue with people saying we won't speak Spanish here with signs like that so people can't expect to come in. I do want to touch on that. And then the second one was this bill that's in it's the Senate right now today, right? The Senate wants to extend in-state tuition to children of immigrants, including illegal immigrants. And what are the economic benefits of that potentially? So let me start with the second one. And I only learned of this bill yesterday when I got here. So I haven't really thought long and hard about it, but I actually don't think I'm in favor of it. And this is why. It's not because I don't think immigrants are or children of immigrants are any more or less deserving than anybody else who's here. It's because I actually really don't think they should be doing in-state and out-of-state tuition for anybody. So when we start thinking about spillovers, so that's the key for me here is the spillovers. All of you who are getting in-state tuition are spilling over some of the cost of your education onto taxpayers who don't control your decisions. That leads to inefficiently too many of you coming to college. Some of you probably shouldn't be here. So extending that, of course not this audience, because this audience self-selected, right, by coming to an extracurricular event. So when people object, immigrants are going to come here and consume services that take tax dollars, well, this would be one more extension of that. So I guess I don't favor extending it to them. But along with that, I favor getting rid of it for the rest of you, too. So I want to treat them consistently, but consistently with the zero. So it's not a discrimination issue on that. It's a spillover cost issue for me on that, I think. And with this discrimination one that you raise, I do think it's still an issue. And I think that those of us who disagree with it have a duty to not patronize a place like that and make them pay for it, and as a result you'll see less discrimination. But I don't think there's a role for public policy in it. So I think discrimination or association is something that has to be done on a voluntary basis, and if we want a less discriminating, more moral society, that's something that we have to enforce through social norms, not government laws or policies really. And if you have to do it at the force of policy, you're really not getting what you want anyway. Other questions? Yes?
Yeah. I'm curious, how does NAFTA affect undocumented immigration? Obviously, it was sold between the three countries as something that would reduce undocumented immigration, but it seems, is there enough data to support the fact that it's exacerbating?
No, okay, so it was sold that way, but the key here is like all else isn't constant. Lots else has changed too. So I think on the margin, having more free trade decreases needs for immigrant flows. In fact, actually, if we want to just think about theoretically instead of NAFTA, if you have goods and services, natural resources, labor, and capital. If any three of those are perfectly mobile, the other one can be fixed, and you're going to get the same economic efficiency results. So natural resources, of course, by their very nature, aren't perfectly mobile. But to the extent that labor is freely traded internationally, it's less necessary to have free trade in goods and services. Not that it doesn't help still, but it's just on the margin less necessary. Ditto in the other direction. The more free trade you have in goods and services, the less the need is for the labor to move. Unfortunately, what happens is that we have imperfect trade in all of these things, both capital goods, labor, and goods and services. So you're seeing simultaneous movements of all of them, and that's fine. So I think NAFTA probably on the margin decreases some of immigration, but it won't stop it, nor should it. But on the margin, at least, trade and immigration are substitutes for each other. In fact, look at the United States when it was its most protectionist, basically after the Civil War to the turn of the century. During that time, we had an exterior barrier to goods and services, higher tariffs, but we had a huge internal market and a completely free market in labor, so you had tons of new laborers coming in, and that was substituting for the trade in goods and services internationally to some extent. Other questions? Yes? Okay, so as if I haven't said anything that controversial yet today, let's see what we can do with education. The justification for using taxpayer money to help more people go to college would be that in doing so, there's a spillover benefit to them being educated that doesn't internalize to them. So usually the argument would have to be they become a better citizen, informed voter because it's in their voting patterns that they actually impact and spill over onto the rest of you, dictating what type of public policies you get. I don't think college does a very good job at making people better at that at all, and actually might, in most cases, make them worse. The other part is private return, so things that will make you a more productive worker for businesses or whatever. But that's internalized to you already in terms of your wages that you can earn. So if college is going to have a return for you that makes you more productive, you've got every incentive to get it already. We don't need other people to pay for you to get it. Now, you might come back with the argument that, well, there's a wealth constraint, we can't afford to go. Well, we have capital markets in this country where you can take loans, and we have student loan markets that are very generous and easy to get student loans. So if the payoff's really there for you going, take the loans, get the education, be a productive citizen, that's a great thing. But we shouldn't be spilling over the cost to others. And there's another aspect of it. A lot of college, I mean, you're learning things, but there's a lot of it's signaling too, right? You get done the 4 years so that you've got the piece of paper that says, I had the dedication to go through and wake up in the morning, or at least most mornings, get to class, pass exams, get through 4 years of it. That certifies me. In some sense, there might be a race between workers who are all getting certified, but it would be better if none of you actually got certified. It's like a prisoner's dilemma game a little bit. So as we subsidize it, we get more inefficient movement in that way. I know your admissions people are probably loving this. Other questions? Yes?
Hi. I heard you mention earlier about how most taxes paid by the immigrants go to the federal government, but most services consumed are on the state level.
Or local.
Or local. I was thinking that as far as the local level, you didn't mention sales tax, which seems like would be one of the largest taxes on any population. Most of the population seems like a large chunk of it would be sales tax.
Yeah, so I think sales tax, actually, so this is a great point. I didn't say this when I was talking about immigrants paying taxes. Obviously, as they consume goods and services, they're paying sales tax if you're in a state with a sales tax. Most of the time, I mean, there are local, very local sales taxes, but most big sales taxes are all going to state governments. And I still think it's the case, like school districts and stuff are a local cost. Like when I say local, I'm really talking like city and town. So I think states are in much better shape than like local cities and towns. But I suppose, so like one way to start addressing this when I said reform tax policy would be move away from local property taxes towards local sales taxes or something like that. Other questions? Oh, yeah, so I think this goes with the welfare state and open immigration being incompatible in the long run. But in the short run, an amnesty program for the illegals who are currently in the country, most of them are younger people who are going to be workers. So it would actually help sustain Social Security. Like, let's be honest, Social Security is by definition a Ponzi scheme. It depends, it doesn't actually make investments. This is definitional. It's not, you can like the Ponzi scheme, you can say, I like this Ponzi scheme, that's cool. But it doesn't make an investment. It takes current money that comes in to pay people who are retired. So it depends on, as that population gets older and retires, bring in more and more workers in order to fuel the funds for the older ones. That's how it operates. And don't give me this trust fund stuff. That's just general tax revenue IOUs. So it's like the government having two pockets and paying out of one and putting an IOU in the other. Doesn't work. Try doing that in your own lives. So an amnesty program for current illegals would be bringing new people into the Ponzi scheme, so it would perpetuate it and allow it to go longer. I think people are afraid that if they come in, it's not going to be old age retirement, but Medicare or Medicaid, I always forget which one's which, but the aid to poorer people or whatever is going to have a bigger draw because of immigrants who come in and put a suction on it and pull it down. And that may or may not be the case, I don't know. But I think certainly in the short run, at least for the old age retirement benefit part, it would make the system work longer, in my mind, unfortunately. Long run, I mean, it depends, you'd have to have, so it would depend what our final equilibrium on immigration is, right? So in the interim, as we work our way up to what the optimal population of the United States is, it would perpetuate the system, making it last longer, because most of the people who would come here would be people coming here to work. But once you reach whatever that optimal number is, your Ponzi scheme's up unless you have a higher birth rate again. It's going to go bankrupt. That's it. It's just a matter of when. So it would just make it longer. I was on a TV show a couple weeks ago, and someone was talking about the Madoff scandal and how they went to the SEC time and time again, and the SEC turned it down and didn't do anything. And they said, should you be able to sue the government for not shutting down this Ponzi scheme? I said, why, when it runs its own? And instead of fraud like Madoff, they actually mandate you get into it. Further questions? Yes?
Hi, my name is Jose Sanchez. I'm from State College, and I just wanted to ask you if you can comment on what are some of the possible benefits of passing the Green Act and federal and national level.
So describe to me exactly what it's going to do at the national level that's different than what we're talking about at the state level.
Pretty much the federal level of the agreement would allow students to, they will be put on the pathway of legal citizenship, and it would allow them to pretty much not just use whatever, I mean, their college or university degrees, to get a job, so.
Listen, I think we should be making a move towards treating all people in the United States equally in the law. And then we have to address what those laws should entitle us to, and I think a lot of you will probably have differences with me over what those laws should entitle. But I think part of the objection to immigrants usually is things in the law that entitle people to stuff, and as a result, they've pushed for restrictions against people who are immigrants or from somewhere else, and I think that's wrong. I also think it's, by the way, the reason why places like Sweden traditionally developed huge welfare states is because, at least before, this is changing, they didn't have large immigrant populations. Smaller, homogeneous populations are more generous with each other. Larger, more diverse populations are more stingy when it comes to instituting these type of benefits. So I think we might have to address that. If you want a larger, more multicultural, diverse immigrant society in the United States, accept with that you're going to have a smaller welfare state or none at all. All right, well, I thank you all for your time today. Oh, wait, there's one more.
So I'm Joan Fox, I'm the Dean of Letters, Arts, and Sciences. I'm one of the sponsors. I really was intrigued about you're talking about foreign aid, and that this is a healthier form of foreign aid, is to have immigrant populations. I'm curious, are there studies as to how much money they send back to their home country, and is that a positive foreign aid as well?
Yeah, so that's a great point, and one that I actually often bring up and I skipped over today. So it's not just the immigrants who come here that is development, it's also that they send a lot of money back home in the form of remittances. And there's lots, and that won't get you long-term prosperity in the home country still, but it can help real people's lives. So one of the huge problems with the intergovernmental aid is that you're going through these inherently corrupt governments in the third world who don't want to use the money effectively and don't know how to use the money effectively. With remittances, you're going directly from a person who has local knowledge of the particular circumstances of people he cares about, who's sending money back to them, and has an incentive to monitor how they're using it. So actually, I learned when I was giving this talk one time in Virginia, a guy came up and he said, you know, I have a lot of immigrant workers who work on my farm, and it's just the gossip that goes on between them. He says they send remittances home, but they hear, one of them hears from their family member that one of the other guy's family members are drinking the money away. As a result, he hears about that and he stops sending him money for a while. So there's like a different monitoring mechanism there, different incentives. So the money gets there, it helps people. The reason it won't turn into prosperity at these places is it's actually a similar reason for like why microfinance can help people better their lives a little bit but won't get you long-term prosperity is bad governance. So it can help them get a little bit wealthier, but you know, like microfinance is good at getting someone who has a small chicken farm to going up to, you know, 100 chickens, but they can never become Purdue, because as soon as they try to become Purdue, they're going to have to pay off the government, they're going to get licensed, they're going to have all sorts of regulations that drag them down. So it's something that helps the people who are back home. It's just not going to get us long-term growth probably, but it's an important one, and I left it out. Thanks. Yes?
So my question is about working conditions and impact of immigration. It doesn't necessarily keep wages down. Is there a negative impact on union membership or assertion of rights in the workplace, intimidation of workers, that sort of thing?
So working conditions and wages, this is like one of my favorite things because I do like a lot of stuff on sweatshops. Working conditions and wages are intimately tied together. So what an employee cares about is total compensation package. An employer is largely indifferent between giving it to him in terms of wages or giving it to him in terms of better other compensation, health, safety, environment, whatever you want to figure out, because it's just a cost to the employer. So the employer, if he gets the mix between wages and other stuff right, he can get the employee for the lowest net total price possible. If he gets the mix wrong, he ends up overpaying to get the employee to have the same level of happiness. So I would say that in this case, the immigrants coming in, if you're not seeing the push down in wages, I don't think you're seeing a push down in working conditions or other things. And if you are, it's because employee preferences are such that would lead to that in the first world. I don't think so, because generally what we see is health, safety, all of these things are what economists call normal goods. As income goes up, you demand more of them, which is why you see it's not really differences in regulation so much as differences in well-being. As countries get richer, you see health and safety improving on the job all over the place, and it's because as workers get wealthier, they demand more of those things for themselves. When they're desperately poor, they don't demand, they want most of it in money just so they can feed, shelter, and clothe their family. So I don't think you're seeing a big effect of that in the US today. Yes?
So you mentioned how much hate mail you get when you write just a small article on immigration, and it's my experience that a lot of our representatives shy away from the issue because it does diminish their popularity. What is your opinion on our political system, whether or not at this point, anytime in the near future, for any meaningful immigration reform?
Could you just say the last part again a little farther away from the microphone?
What's your opinion on
That didn't work.
our political system and whether or not it points anytime in the near future for meaningful immigration reform?
Oh, okay. So what's the opinion of the political system and what that implies for any sort of meaningful immigration reform? So in general, what our political system does, right? Politicians have incentives to concentrate benefits on small groups and spread costs over lots of people. When they spread the cost over lots of people don't know about the program or they barely feel it, but when they drop all the benefits on one group, that group really knows it and will lobby intensely for it and to keep it. So that's why we have the runaway spending problem that you do. You get the government that this last election was basically a mandate to cut spending, but now what are those guys cutting? Like $100 billion? We're talking like a teeny % of the deficit or the debt. Because whenever they identify something specific, there's someone who lobbies to not lose their specific one, but there's no mandate from taxpayers on exactly what to cut. So basically, logic of politics is concentrate benefits, disperse costs. So immigration reform, contentious issue. So when it comes to actually deporting the people who are here, that's a very concentrated cost. I don't think that'll ever happen. So I think they're going to just keep continuing. So this is stepping outside of role of just economists. This is just, so take it with a grain of salt, political forecast. They'll keep trying to put off this issue as much as they can because it is one that they risk popularity on and that a lot of people have strong feelings on. Right now, our current recession is taking the pressure off of them, so they'll do nothing about immigration, legal or illegal, while we're in a slow time. When it heats back up, if it puts more pressure on the border, we'll see if they do something then, but it's not going to involve actually kicking people out of the country who are already here. I just don't see that happening. Yeah, but when we catch illegal immigrants, we don't do long-term incarceration for them here. So it's not like a huge benefit to the prison lobby. The prison lobby's too busy making sure that drugs stay illegal so that they can keep their jobs. I don't think immigration's their big issue. All right, guys, well, it was fun as always. Thank you.